Welcome to RealClear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we look into two politically induced disasters, one in science and the other in economics. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with former Utah State Senator Dan Lillienquist about the underfunded public pension time bomb threatening to bankrupt state governments. Up first, we're pleased to welcome Marc Edwards, professor of environmental and water resources engineering at Virginia Tech and a former MacArthur Fellow. Marc, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Marc, I asked you on because a paper you published in the Journal of Environmental Engineering Science caught my eye. The title is Academic Research in the 21st Century, Maintaining Scientific Integrity in a Climate of Perverse Incentives and Hypercompetition. I'd like to drill down into your personal experiences dealing with unethical behavior in big science, but let me start by quoting the abstract of your paper verbatim. I ask our listeners to bear with me because this is pretty disturbing stuff. Over the last 50 years, we argue that incentives for academic scientists have become increasingly perverse in terms of competition for research funding, development of quantitative metrics to measure performance, and a changing business model for higher education itself. Furthermore, decreased discretionary funding at the federal and state level is creating a hyper-competitive environment between government agencies, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Institutes of Health, and the Centers for Disease Control. For scientists in these agencies and for academics seeking funding from all sources, the combination of perverse incentives and decreased funding increases pressure that can lead to unethical behavior. If a critical mass of scientists become untrustworthy, a tipping point is possible in which the entire scientific enterprise itself becomes inherently corrupt and public trust is lost, risking a new dark age with devastating consequences to humanity. Marc, what possessed you to write such strong words?
It was my experiences over the last decade in the Washington, D.C. lead and drinking water crisis, which demonstrated that academic and government science agencies are not upholding the scientific method to the extent that they once did. So realize the D.C. lead and drinking water crisis from 2001 to 2004 was a government-caused disaster. It elevated the blood lead of thousands of children in our nation's capital, and federal laws on safe lead levels were broken, and the environmental policemen who we pay to protect us actually became environmental criminals and harmed citizens in the most powerful city in the United States. And so after this crime was revealed by parents and lead-poisoned children and Washington Post reporters, the perpetrators of this crime at government agencies were able to cover it up to evade responsibility. And they did it by fabricating health reports that said no one was harmed. And essentially, they were able to pull the wool over the eyes of the public and investigative reporters and even the U.S. Congress. And so it was my work over about a decade where I revealed misconduct originating with or that was encouraged by these agencies, specifically the EPA and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. And I showed there were reports that were written without any data to back it up that anyone could find.
And this was all before the Flint water crisis.
Oh, yeah, years before. Falsified conclusions. And these falsified government reports actually led to policies that wasted hundreds of millions of dollars and caused even more lead poisoning of children. And so my friend, David Lewis, who is a former EPA whistleblower, coined this new phenomenon of government agency science corruption as institutional scientific misconduct. And this is fabrication of science to promote a government agency agenda. It is inherently unscientific, and to even, find historical parallels, you really have to go to Soviet science under Stalin and Lyshenkoism, where if you believed in Mendelian genetics, you could actually be killed.
So most people aren't familiar with the D.C. story, but they're very familiar with what happened in Flint. Now, you got called in on that. What happened there?
Well, because these agencies were unable to admit or learn from their mistakes in Washington, D.C., we were expecting another man-made disaster. And so when we got a call from a mother in Flint who figured out on her own that her children had been lead poisoned by exposure to drinking water, and she further figured out that federal laws were not being followed, we were not the least bit surprised. We were actually preparing for that day. And when we further realized that the state environmental, Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and the EPA knew about this and were not willing to do anything about it, we essentially declared scientific war on our own government science agencies to reveal this, what we felt was an environmental crime in progress. And I think history has proven us correct. To date, an EPA administrator has resigned. There have been 8 civil servant scientists and engineers who've been indicted. And the extent of this environmental injustice in terms of neighborhoods of lead-poisoned children, about a dozen people dying from Legionnaire's disease, and a city's vital infrastructure destroyed have revealed the extent of this man-made disaster.
Marc, what do you think caused the professional scientists within these government agencies to behave so badly?
As scientists, our product is truth. And our brand is based on trust. And, what happens to us, what happens to the world if science as a whole becomes untrustworthy and willing to cut corners? And what happens in particular if government science becomes untrustworthy? And frankly, our whole technological society can no longer properly function. And so what happens in a case of institutional scientific misconduct is that scientific truth is sacrificed to promote an agenda of a science agency. In the case of the CDC in Washington, D.C., their agenda was to promote children who are lead poisoned by lead paint exposure, which is a horrible evil, and cover up evidence of harm from children being exposed to lead in water, which is a government source of lead supplied in a product that's intended for human consumption. And unfortunately, there's no way to make money off of lead exposure from drinking water, whereas lead paint exposure is a multi-billion-dollar a year business. So what you have is cutting of corners, compromising the scientific method and scientific integrity to promote some kind of a policy that's in the interest of a government science agency.
So, Marc, you've mentioned these specific cases. How widespread do you think such motivations are among the thousands of scientists employed across government agencies?
I think the issue is really the vast majority of scientists want to do their job and do it with high integrity. But in my experience, in the case of these 2 man-made disasters, it was upper-level management that pressured them to not do their jobs. Literally, it's incredible to see how hard these folks work to do bad science, to not do their jobs. And the one thing that can kind of get you fired from these agencies today is actually doing your job. I've seen it happen to some of the best scientists that I've known, where some trumped up charge was used to pressure them to leave or fire them. And even when a jury upheld the fact that their careers were wrongfully destroyed, the maximum payment they were allowed to get was $250,000. So you kind of have a corrupt culture where they reward loyalty to the agency first and foremost, and the idea of being a scientist with integrity and of serving the public and of serving the truth is way down on the list of priorities.
And instead, is it a policy agenda that they're following?
I think that we're entering an era of declining discretionary resources, and realize this is relatively new territory. I mean, historically, agency budgets have either increased or remained static, but we're now looking at a time where agencies are actually competing with another for an ever-shrinking pie. And I think this is kind of empowering upper management who really, first and foremost, want to perpetuate their agency's future and their funding, and they are willing to compromise scientific integrity to do that.
Marc, I'd like to return to the wider issue of scientific integrity you raise in your paper in the Journal of Environmental Science. How serious is your concern that the public may lose trust in scientists inside and outside government, much as it has in politicians and journalists?
I think that's already happened for certain segments of society. I think some people who've been looking in on that, who learned the hard way, as I have, that some of these agencies are no longer trustworthy, are no longer serving the public. Once burned, you're not going to forget that. And so I think that we're already paying a horrible price in terms of lost trust. And what happens when we can't trust government science? People turn to other alternatives. People begin to have conspiracy theories. People even ignore good science when it's presented to them. So, our modern societies just can't properly function without trustworthy, high integrity government science agencies. And that's why we have to make sure that in the future they uphold the highest standards of scientific integrity and not the lowest standards, which is what I encountered in the Flint and Washington, D.C. lead and drinking water crisis.
Your co-author in the Journal of Environmental Science papers, Siddhartha Roy, penned a piece that I came across, a response to an editorial about the imaginary line that scientists are not supposed to cross in terms of revealing corruption or incompetence. Tell us about that.
Well, it was incredible because here we voluntarily, using our own money and in collaborating with Flint residents, declared war on government science agencies who were failing to follow federal law, who were essentially destroying a city. And we were vindicated in every way imaginable. I mean, anyone who's looked at the Flint disaster, no matter what your political party, comes away just shaking their heads and saying, this is one of the most horrific failures of government science agencies in history. And we helped to expose it. And much to my shock, within the academy, there were some people who were angry at us for doing this. They felt that we were exposing these agencies, which also fund our research. They fund my research, or at least used to. They probably won't in the future, by the way. But they were calling us out for essentially subjecting the entire academic community to retaliation, and basically said that there was no cause just enough by which a professor should do what we did in Flint and expose this environmental crime because it could jeopardize our funding, which is just so precious, and we can't afford to lose it.
Political advocacy groups often accuse scientists employed by corporations of nefarious motives. How do perverse commercial incentives compare to perverse academic incentives?
I think that we all understand that with a profit motive, people can tend to let their biases get the best of them, and sometimes they skew science. Now, we have built-in safeguards for that. We have a healthy amount of skepticism for science that arises from industry. And in fact, as a society, we've made it in the business interest of industry to be ethical, or else we will put you out of business. I mean, witness British Petroleum in the Gulf of Mexico paying tens and tens of billions of dollars in fines. And unfortunately, we don't have similar skepticism or safeguards against fraudulent or fabricated government science, because we simply assume, they have no profit motive to misbehave, so therefore they must be ethical. And unfortunately, as the DC and Flint stories have shown us in no uncertain terms, that this is very dangerous, that government scientists do have incentives to falsify results. And the even scarier part is that even when these problems were exposed, the agencies refused to admit wrongdoing. They refused to accept responsibility. They refused to correct their policies so that something like this would never happen again. And at the end of the day, you're just like, wow, we have no check and balance on their power because no one ever thought they would behave this way. And so to some extent, because of that, I fear that this is actually a greater danger to society than the better understood problem of, skewed science from industry, which to some extent, we've gotten under control over the years.
How effective are watchdog agencies like the Office of Research Integrity in ferreting out falsification, fabrication, and fraud in scientific research?
It depends on the agency. With my experience with the U.S. EPA and the Centers for Disease Control, the Office of Science Integrity people that I dealt with had zero integrity. One of them even issued a false press release that said they'd thoroughly investigated my claims of falsified science on this CDC report. And when this person was subpoenaed by Congress, he actually admitted he never investigated anything. So what are you going to do if these watchdog groups within the agency turn out to be nothing more than an internal investigation that's part of the problem and not part of the solution?
Marc, you've been branded a troublemaker by parts of the scientific establishment. What kind of personal toll has this exacted?
Well, given that I have a historical perspective dating to the Stalin era and the fact that people who dissented with the government position were shot there, I feel relatively lucky. I still have my job and, I have lost funding. There's no doubt I've lost a lot of friends, but, at the end of the day, science is about seeking out the truth and taking a stand, and I feel very, very confident in what we've done, and no one has ever been able to prove that anything we've said was incorrect.
What course of action do you recommend to young scientists coming up when they face this kind of fraud?
I think the most important thing we teach students in my graduate engineering ethics class is do not forget the person you are. Do not forget the ideals that you once upheld, that you wanted to do science as a public good to improve the world, and realize that our institutions, starting with our academic institutions and no matter what job you have, they have a tendency to teach you to be unethical, to teach you to become cynical and willfully blind. And if you are not careful, you could wake up someday making a huge mistake, just like those scientists in Washington, D.C. and Flint did. No one gets up in the morning or goes into a profession with the goal of poisoning children or destroying a city. But this is what could happen to you if you are not very careful and you let the world change you, if you let the world turn you into something you once abhorred.
How can funding mechanisms and incentive structures in science be changed to encourage ethical behavior and protect whistleblowers?
I think the best funding model out there is the National Science Foundation, where it's not perfect, but it's generally beyond politics and, they're decided by merit to the extent that that's possible. If you start getting into the funding mechanisms of the Centers for Disease Control or the US EPA, there's really a lot of politics involved, and basically they reward people for being loyal to the agency, for getting conclusions that the agency wants to hear. I saw this over and over again. Some of my friends actually, I believe, fabricated reports, made up data to provide the EPA with a conclusion that they wanted. And even though that result ended up wasting hundreds of millions of dollars and poisoning children, there was always a place for them. There's always a place in this world for a hired gun. Unfortunately, there's not a place in this world, at least in our society, for whistleblowers, because once you've, blown the whistle, you're deemed disloyal and you're going to lose your funding and a lot of your friends.
Marc, very few members of the public read scientific journals or have the training to judge the quality of the science for themselves. What advice do you have for ordinary people when they read stories written by advocacy journalists using phrases like settled science or science deniers to silence skeptics?
Well, I think that is presenting something that's inherently unscientific. It's a deficit model where it says that science has knowledge and that you, as the public, you are ignorant and you will listen to us. And this kind of is dangerous because, in the past, I think science used to exist more so in a symbiotic relationship with the public, where we actually partnered more with the public. We provided them truth. We provided them science as a public good. And in return, we earned their trust, and they gave us authority, and they tended to give us funding. And frankly, when people talk about this poor state of affairs between science and society, rather than blame the public as being ignorant or not interested in sciences, I more commonly look at what we have done wrong within science, how we can improve our model. And in fact, I think we're responsible for more than half of the lost trust in science because too many of us are not trustworthy.
Well, Marc, you've been through a lot in the course of the last decade or so. Are you ready to throw in the towel, or is there still hope?
Oh, absolutely not. I feel I'm actually the most optimistic scientist on the planet because I look at what we have with these agencies and our current state of modern science, and I say it is not good enough. We have to get back to the scientific method, to upholding the highest standards of science integrity. I believe that will happen. Failure is not an option, and the fate of all humanity rests on our success.
Well, Marc, keep up the good work. Thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your story.
I'm glad to. Thank you for having me.
That was Marc Edwards, Professor of Environmental and Water Resources Engineering at Virginia Tech, here on RealClear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. RealClear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with RealClear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To catch up on our past shows, stop by realclearradio.org and check out our podcast archive of over 300 interviews. Listen to movers and shakers like Peter Thiel, Steve Forbes, Sal Khan, Grover Norquist, Matt Ridley, Walter Williams, Gary Kasparov, Lenore Skenazy, Virginia Postrel, Bruce Yandel, Harvey Silverglade, Vernon Smith, Kevin Kelly, James Grant, Ralph Nader, David Stockman, Matt Kibbe, John Mackey, Jeffrey Tucker, and many other accomplished thinkers and doers from locations as diverse as Vienna, Budapest, Dubai, Guatemala, London, Lebanon, and across the U.S. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Donors Trust, the donor-advised fund committed to promoting a free society. For more information, visit donorstrust.org. Ahead, we'll speak with former Utah State Senator Dan Lillienquist to learn what he and his colleagues did to save the Beehive State from being driven into bankruptcy by runaway public pension obligations. Stay tuned.